So, if you break a bone, an X-ray gives you a really clean binary answer.
Right, it's broken or it's not.
Exactly.
Okay.
The doctor points to the jagged white line on the film and, there's your absolute truth. But when you look at the price of a gallon of gasoline,
Oh, the X-ray machine is completely broken.
it is. When you try to diagnose exactly what it costs on, any given Tuesday, the math just feels entirely made up. Because look, the United States currently produces more oil than it consumes, right?
We are the undisputed heavyweight champion of oil production globally.
Yeah, but we still import millions of barrels a day from foreign countries. It makes no sense. So, today, for this deep dive, we are going to figure out why. We've got a massive stack of market analyses, trade data, government agency reports, and we're just going to deconstruct the entire world of oil.
Which is really the ultimate diagnostic puzzle if you think about it. Because you are dealing with a commodity that is priced globally but refined locally. Traded virtually on Wall Street, but physically constrained by underground chemistry and maritime geography all at the exact same time.
It's wild. Okay, let's unpack this.
To start, if you want to understand the numbers spinning on the pump when you fill your car, you have to completely abandon the idea that oil is just oil.
Because it's not a single uniform liquid.
Exactly. It's a complex chain of highly localized, politically charged, and chemically specific markets.
And that is exactly the baseline we need to establish. I mean, before we can even talk about what a barrel costs, we first have to understand the physical reality of the dirt.
Where it lives, who pulls it out, and who burns it.
Yeah. And looking at the global landscape, the data separates the world into three completely different metrics. And mixing them up is where I think most people get the oil market completely wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
So we have reserves, we have production, and we have consumption.
Getting those three distinct concepts straight is the foundational requirement for understanding energy geopolitics. I mean, who has it is absolutely not the same as who pumps it. And neither of those is the same as who burns it. So let's start with reserves. Reserves are a stock measure.
Like inventory.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is the physical oil sitting underground that, geologists and engineers believe is economically recoverable under our current technological conditions.
The oil still in the earth.
Right. And the center of gravity for proven reserves is heavily, disproportionately concentrated in the Middle East, along with massive deposits in Venezuela and Canada.
Right, because Canada's oil sands, which we'll definitely get into later because extracting that is basically a massive mining operation, those are counted as proven reserves.
They are.
So they just have these mind-boggling amounts of potential energy sitting there in the tundra. And Venezuela has oceans of this heavy sludge. So to use a restaurant analogy, Venezuela essentially has the biggest pantry.
That's a great way to look at it, the pantry.
Yeah.
But having a full pantry doesn't mean you're cooking the most meals.
Right.
Which brings us to production. And production is a flow measure. This is the volume of barrels physically brought to the surface and put into the market every single day.
And this is where the geopolitical map completely flips.
Totally flips. In 2024, the United States was the #1 producer on the planet, pumping out over 20.1 million barrels per day.
Wow.
Yeah, that is roughly a fifth of the entire world's daily supply. Russia sits in second place, and Saudi Arabia is third.
So Venezuela has the biggest pantry, but the U.S. has the busiest kitchen. We are pulling it out of the ground faster than anyone else in human history.
We are. And then the final metric is consumption, also a flow measure.
Who is actually setting this stuff on fire?
Right, transforming it, putting it into a combustion engine. The global total in 2024 hovered right around 101.4 million barrels per day.
Over 100 million barrels every single day.
Every day. And the leaders eating those meals are the U.S., China, and India.
Okay, and just looking at that geographic spread tells you why the oil market is inherently volatile, doesn't it?
Oh, 100%. The world's recoverable oil base is heavily concentrated in a few specific regions that are, thousands of miles away from the regions that are consuming the most.
It's a massive spatial disconnect.
Exactly. That intense disconnect between the reserves and the demand centers is why shipping choke points, international sanctions, and maritime insurance matter so much more in the oil market than in almost any other global commodity.
But this brings us to the massive paradox in the data. And this was the thing that completely broke my mental model of how global trade works when I was looking at the sources.
The U.S. import numbers.
Yes. The U.S. is the world's largest producer, pumping over 20 million barrels a day. And we're the largest consumer, using about 19 million barrels a day.
Right.
So if I have 20 apples and I only want to eat 19 apples, I shouldn't need to go to the grocery store. I have a surplus.
In theory, yes.
But the data shows the U.S. is still importing massive amounts of crude oil every single day, with over 60% of those imports coming down from Canada. Why on earth are we buying Canadian oil when we have extra American oil? That sounds like terrible logistics.
It sounds crazy, but it's because of what the refining industry calls the quality mismatch.
Okay.
This is what I meant when I said oil is not just oil. It's a highly specific chemical puzzle. Crude oil comes out of the ground in dozens of different varieties, and it's generally measured on two main scales.
Density and sulfur content?
Exactly. You have light oil and heavy oil, which is the density. And you have sweet oil and sour oil, which refers to the sulfur. Sweet oil has very low sulfur. Sour oil has a ton of it.
So heavy sour oil is basically this dense, thick sludge that smells like rotten eggs because of all the sulfur.
Yeah, it's pretty nasty stuff. And decades ago, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s, U.S. refiners, especially those massive sprawling industrial complexes along the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, they looked at the global market and made a multi-billion-dollar bet.
What kind of bet?
Well, at the time, heavy sour crude from places like Venezuela, Mexico, and the Middle East was very, very cheap.
Yeah.
And it was cheap precisely because it was so hard to refine.
Right.
It's difficult to process, it destroys pipes, and you have to remove all that sulfur to meet environmental regulations for gasoline.
So the U.S. refiners spent billions building specific hardware like hydrocrackers, coking units, desulfurization plants, just to be able to buy the cheapest, ugliest oil in the world and turn it into pristine gasoline.
Exactly. They built factories designed specifically to chew through sludge. They optimized their entire multi-billion-dollar footprints for heavy sour crude.
So then...
Then the U.S. shale revolution happened.
Right.
Through horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, places like the Permian Basin in Texas and the Bakken in North Dakota suddenly started pumping millions of new barrels of oil. But shale oil is almost entirely light, sweet crude.
So it's thin, it flows easily, it has very little sulfur.
Yeah.
Wait, so we suddenly had an ocean of premium, easy-to-refine oil right in our own backyard. That sounds like a good thing.
It is a good thing, unless you just spend $5 billion building a machine designed to chew sludge.
Oh, I see.
Right. If you take this new, beautiful, light, sweet crude and shove it into a Gulf Coast refinery built for heavy sour, the refinery actually loses money.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The expensive coking units and sulfur removal plants just sit idle. The distillation columns get completely unbalanced. It is quite literally like putting high-octane racing fuel into a heavy-duty diesel tractor. The machine is just not calibrated for the input.
Wow, so that perfectly explains the paradox. To optimize those multi-billion-dollar Gulf Coast beasts, we actually export our premium light sweet shale oil to countries in Europe and Asia whose refineries are built for it.
Precisely.
And to feed our own domestic machines, we import heavy sour oil, predominantly piping it down from the Canadian oil sands, because that is what our hardware physically demands.
Exactly. Import dependence in the modern era is very often about feedstock fit, not a simple lack of domestic production.
That is fascinating.
And understanding that logistical reality helps us categorize the major players. When you look at the top consumer nations, they effectively fall into three distinct buckets of vulnerability.
Okay, let's bring those down.
First, you have the self-supplied producers. This is the U.S., Canada, Saudi Arabia, Russia. For these countries, energy security isn't about whether they have enough physical liquid within their borders.
It's purely about plumbing.
Exactly. Do they have the pipelines, the right types of refineries, and the storage facilities to manage the flow?
So they control their own destiny, as long as their internal infrastructure holds up.
Right. The second bucket is the hybrid producer importers. China is the ultimate example here, along with a country like Indonesia.
Because people forget that China actually produces a massive amount of oil.
Over 4 million barrels a day. They have a massive domestic industry, but their economy is so incredibly huge that they consume upwards of 16 million barrels a day.
Right.
So despite pumping millions of barrels from their own soil, they are structurally, inescapably dependent on massive imports just to keep the lights on and the factories running.
And then there's a third bucket, which honestly seems like the most terrifying position to be in geopolitically.
The import-dependent refiners,
Right.
Japan, South Korea, Germany, India. These nations have colossal industrial economies, massive populations, and virtually zero oil beneath their own soil.
None at all.
None. They have no domestic buffer whatsoever. If the global supply chains freeze, they don't just face higher prices, their entire physical economies grind to a halt within weeks.
Yeah.
They are existentially vulnerable to maritime shipping routes.
Which is terrifying. But speaking of consumption, there is a really fascinating anomaly in the global data. If you look at the top consumers in the world, right there on the list is Singapore.
In the
Singapore is consuming nearly 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. But Singapore is a tiny island city-state with a population of under 6 million people.
Right.
The math on that doesn't make any sense. I mean, they can't possibly be driving that much.
They aren't. Singapore is the great exception that proves the rule about how we measure consumption. That 1.5 million barrels isn't going into the gas tanks of local commuters.
Okay, so where is it going?
Well, Singapore sits at one of the most critical geographic crossroads on the planet, the Strait of Malacca, right between the oil exporters of the Middle East and the massive demand centers of East Asia. Because of that geography, Singapore built itself into a colossal integrated refining, blending, and marine bunkering hub.
And marine bunkering being the fuel for the massive cargo ships.
Exactly. Thousands of massive container ships and oil tankers stop in Singapore to refuel. Furthermore, Singapore imports raw crude, runs it through its massive, highly efficient refineries, and then immediately exports the refined products.
The gasoline, the diesel, the aviation fuel.
Yeah, out to neighboring countries. So in the data, it looks like Singapore is, quote-unquote, consuming all this oil, but what they're really doing is industrial transformation. They are processing it on behalf of the rest of Asia.
Wow. And that geographic flow from the Middle East to Asia is the central artery of the global economy. I mean, the geopolitical geometry here is staggering. Let's talk about Japan.
Yeah, Japan's a great example.
As of early 2025, Japan was relying on the Middle East for roughly 94% of its crude oil imports. And South Korea's numbers are really similar.
When you realize that 94% of the energy required to power the third or fourth largest economy in the world is originating in the Persian Gulf, you immediately understand why the Strait of Hormuz is the most heavily militarized and heavily monitored strip of water on Earth.
Because it's a massive choke point.
Yeah, if you are a policymaker in Tokyo or Seoul, your entire modern existence is tethered to a tanker route that, at its narrowest point, is only 20 miles wide. The route concentration risk is immense. If that strait closes due to conflict, there is no pipeline alternative.
You're just cut off. But then you have a country like India, which is also in that vulnerable third bucket of having no domestic oil, but they've played a completely different strategic game over the last few years.
Oh, India's post-2022 strategy is a masterclass in ruthless economic opportunism.
How so?
Well, when Western sanctions hit Russian oil following the invasion of Ukraine, Europe stopped buying seaborne Russian crude. Suddenly, Russia had millions of barrels of oil with nowhere to go.
Right.
And they were forced to offer it at a massive discount just to find buyers. Now, India historically didn't buy much Russian oil because the shipping distance from the Baltic Sea is so far. But they realized the discount was so deep that it completely covered the extra freight cost.
So they just stepped in and started vacuuming up sanctioned oil?
In massive quantities. I mean, at certain points, Russia went from being a marginal supplier to India to making up 40% of India's total crude imports.
Wow.
Yeah, India would buy the discounted crude, run it through their own refineries, and then, perfectly legally under the design of the sanctions at the time, export the refined diesel and gasoline back into the global market, sometimes even to Europe.
That is wild.
But India was also incredibly careful. They didn't burn their bridges. They maintained their long-term contracts with Iraq and Saudi Arabia, keeping those relationships warm. They lowered their baseline cost with opportunistic Russian buys, while keeping the Middle East as their structural safety net.
Smart. Very smart. Now, looming over all of this physical movement, of course, is OPEC, and specifically Saudi Arabia. We established earlier that the U.S. shale revolution made America the biggest producer in the world.
Right.
We fundamentally broke OPEC's absolute monopoly on where new supply comes from, but producing more than Saudi Arabia didn't erase their power. Why do they still have so much leverage over the global price if we are pumping more physical liquid than they are?
It's a great question, and the answer comes down to a concept called spare capacity.
Spare capacity.
Yeah. The U.S. oil industry is made up of thousands of independent, publicly traded companies. Their mandate from shareholders is to maximize profit.
Yep.
So if the price of oil is high enough to make money, a company in Texas is going to pump as much as they physically can. They do not deliberately cap a well and hold back 1 million barrels a day just to manage the global macroeconomic weather. They pump at maximum efficient capacity.
So they have no coordination and no incentives to hold back.
Exactly. But the Middle East, led by the Saudi state-owned oil company, operates differently. They maintain what is effectively the world's only massive, readily adjustable shock absorber.
The shock absorber.
Yeah. Saudi Arabia deliberately engineers its fields and its infrastructure to be able to produce millions of barrels a day more than they actually are producing at any given moment. They hold valves in reserve.
So if a war breaks out somewhere else or a massive pipeline goes down in Africa, the Saudis can just turn a dial and flood the market with replacement oil almost instantly.
Or conversely, if demand plummets, they can close the valves and choke off supply to prop up the price.
Right.
U.S. shale changed the competitive structure, absolutely. But shale takes months to drill and complete. Spare capacity takes days to bring online. Because the Middle East holds the vast majority of this cheap, immediate spare capacity, they still hold the fastest and most powerful lever to manipulate price at the margin.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. All right, so we have mapped out the physical realities. We know where the dirt holds the oil, we know the chemical mismatches forcing it onto ships, and we understand the choke points.
The physical map.
Yeah. Now we have to figure out the money. Let's transition into the anatomy of a barrel's cost, because how do we get from a reservoir trapped 2 miles underground to an actual global price tag?
To do that, we have to completely deconstruct the barrel. When you hear that oil is trading at, say, $75, that single number obscures a stack of radically different cost structures.
Okay.
You can think of the true cost of bringing a barrel to market as 4 concentric rings.
4 rings, got it.
And the innermost ring, the baseline, is the lifting cost.
The physical act of getting it out of the ground.
Right. Sometimes this is called the operating expense, or OPEX. The well is already drilled, the pump is in place. What does it cost, day to day, to coax that liquid to the surface?
Like electricity and labor.
Exactly. It's the electricity to run the pump jack, the field labor to monitor the pressure, the cost of separating the water from the oil, routine maintenance. And here is where the geology really dictates the economics.
Oh, so?
Well, for massive conventional fields in the Middle East, the natural underground pressure does most of the work for you. The lifting cost is incredibly low, often just $2 or $3 a barrel.
Wow. Which makes it sound like they are just printing money. But lifting costs is basically a deceptive metric if you ignore the second ring, right? Because you can't just walk out into a desert with a bucket and scoop it up.
Exactly. The second ring is the finding and development cost, or CapEx. Before you can lift a single drop of oil, you have to lease the mineral rights, run highly complex 3D seismic surveys, drill exploratory wells that might turn up dry.
Which happens a lot.
Right, then you have to build gathering pipelines and construct the actual production facilities.
And depending on where you are looking, this cost can be astronomical.
Oh, massive.
Yeah.
Let's say you are drilling in ultra-deep water off the coast of Guyana or Brazil. You are operating a floating city in the middle of the ocean, drilling through a mile of water and then 3 miles of rock beneath the seafloor.
Insane.
Your day-to-day lifting cost might be reasonable once the well is flowing, but your upfront development cost is in the billions of dollars. You are in a massive financial hole before the first barrel ever reaches the surface.
And the industry is on a relentless treadmill just to maintain current output, right? The International Energy Agency noted in the sources that in 2023, the global industry spent $538 billion on upstream capital expenditures.
Over $500 billion.
Yeah.
In a single year.
And a huge chunk of that isn't even to grow production. It's just to fight the natural decline rates of existing fields.
Right. When you poke a hole in a pressurized reservoir, the pressure drops over time. To keep the flow rate flat, you have to constantly drill infill wells or inject water to push the oil out.
So we have lifting cost and we have development cost. What's the third ring?
The state take. This includes royalties, production taxes, corporate taxes, and export duties.
Okay.
You have to remember that in many countries, the state owns the mineral rights, not private citizens. And in many of those countries, the oil sector is the primary engine of the entire national budget.
So it's funding the government.
Exactly. A field might be technically very cheap to drill and operate, but the host government requires a massive percentage of the revenue to fund schools, hospitals, the military, public infrastructure.
So the fiscal burden is layered directly onto the physical cost?
Yeah.
And the fourth ring?
Transport, pipelines, marine terminals, tanker freight, and insurance. An oil barrel has negative value if it is trapped in the middle of a remote basin without a pipeline to carry it to a refinery. You have to pay to move it.
Right. Now, to make these four rings concrete, I want to look at a concept from the data that completely changed my perspective on the industry.
Yeah.
It's the idea of same price, different economics. Let's imagine the global benchmark price for oil today is exactly $75. We are going to look at three different barrels:
Okay.
a Saudi conventional barrel, a Texas Permian shale barrel, and a Canadian oil sands barrel. All three sell into the market for $75. But the businesses behind them are living in entirely different universes. Let's start with the Saudi barrel.
Okay. The Saudi conventional barrel is defined by incredible geology but high fiscal demands. You have massive, highly permeable underground reservoirs. It is fast to drill, and the natural pressure makes it incredibly cheap to lift. Their physical field cost is arguably the lowest in the world. However, their state take requirement is massive. The Saudi government relies heavily on oil revenues to balance its national budget and fund massive diversification projects. So the physical barrel costs almost nothing to produce, but the social and fiscal requirement attached to it is very high. They need a strong global price to fund the nation.
Okay, now let's move to Texas. The Permian shale barrel.
Right. Shale is the ultimate manufacturing process applied to geology. It is a treadmill.
How so?
Well, a shale well involves drilling down 2 miles, turning the drill bit 90 degrees, drilling horizontally for another 2 miles, and then blasting water and sand into the rock to fracture it. You could do this very quickly. You could drill and complete a well in a matter of months. This means shale is highly responsive to price.
So if oil goes to $100, they can deploy rigs and bring new oil online fast.
Exactly. But there is a massive catch for the physics of shale.
A brutal catch, if I recall.
Very brutal. Shale wells suffer from extreme decline rates. A conventional well might decline by 5 or 10% a year. A shale well can see its production drop by 60 or 70% in the very first year.
Wow.
They burst out of the gate, producing a massive amount of oil immediately, and then the flow falls off a cliff.
So to maintain your company's overall production target, you have to relentlessly, endlessly drill new wells just to replace the production you are losing from last year's wells.
Exactly. It requires constant, relentless capital reinvestment. It is a cash-hungry business model that lives and dies by the drill bit.
And then you have the complete opposite end of the spectrum, the Canadian oil sands barrel.
The oil sands are fundamentally different. You aren't really drilling a traditional well. You are either open-pit mining bitumen, which is a semi-solid tar-like substance, or you're using steam injection to melt it underground so it can be pumped up.
Which sounds expensive.
Oh, it requires colossal upfront capital. It takes years of environmental permitting, massive engineering, and billions of dollars to build an oil sands facility. It is a mega project.
But once you turn it on...
Once you turn it on, the decline rate is essentially zero. It's not like shale. An oil sands project will produce a steady, predictable stream of oil for 30 or 40 years. The lifting costs are higher because you have to generate all that steam and process the tar, but you don't have to constantly drill new wells.
So at $75 a barrel, the Saudis are funding a sovereign nation. The Texan is frantically drilling 3 new wells to replace the ones that are dying. And the Canadian is slowly, methodically paying down a 30-year mortgage on an industrial mega facility.
Exactly.
3 totally different physical and financial realities, all completely masked by a single $75 global price tag.
And that $75 price tag only gets the barrel to the factory gates. Now it has to be refined.
Right. The crude oil is out of the ground, the taxes are paid, it's moved through the pipe, and now it arrives at the refinery. And here we have to deal with the reality that a 32-gallon barrel of crude oil does not yield 42 gallons of gasoline.
It does not.
You put it through the massive distillation columns, you boil it, and it separates into fractions based on boiling points. You get about 19 to 20 gallons of gasoline, 11 to 12 gallons of diesel, and then a whole bunch of other stuff.
Right. Jet fuel, kerosene, petrochemical feedstocks, and heavy asphalt for paving roads.
So the physical breakdown of the barrel is dictated by chemistry, but the profitability of the refinery is dictated entirely by consumer demand for those specific fractions.
Oh, yes, exactly.
It's essentially a massive, highly toxic butcher shop.
That is the perfect analogy.
Right. A butcher buys a whole cow from the rancher for one set price, but he doesn't sell cow to the consumer. He has to chop it up. His profit margin is determined by how much people are willing to pay for the premium cuts, the steaks, which in our case is the gasoline,
Right.
versus the cheaper cuts like ground beef or the leather, which is the asphalt.
Right.
The butcher has to balance the carcass. If everyone suddenly goes on a diet and stops buying steak, the butcher's going to lose money and might go out of business, even if the cow itself was incredibly cheap to buy.
That is exactly how a refinery operates. And in the financial markets, the metric they use to measure the health of that butcher shop is called the crack spread.
The crack spread.
Yeah. The name comes from the catalytic cracking units in the refinery. Specifically, the industry looks at the 3.2.1 crack spread. It is a mathematical rule of thumb that assumes a typical, complex U.S. refinery can take 3 barrels of raw crude oil and chemically crack them into 2 barrels of gasoline and 1 barrel of diesel, or distillate.
Okay, so the spread is the difference between the cost of the 3 raw barrels and the revenue from the finished products.
Precisely. And understand the crack spread is crucial because it explains why the upstream producers, the guys drilling the wells, and the downstream refiners are often fighting entirely different economic battles.
How so?
Well, the driller just wants the absolute price of crude to be as high as possible. But the refiner doesn't actually care if crude is at $40 or $100. They only care about the margin.
The difference between the raw input and the refined output. Give me an example of how a refiner can get crushed even when the oil market is booming.
Okay, let's say a massive geopolitical panic hits the Middle East. Traders bid the price of raw crude oil up to $120 a barrel. The drillers are ecstatic.
Right, they're making a fortune.
But consumers at home are hit with inflation, the economy slows down, and people stop taking road trips. The demand for gasoline plummets. The refiner is forced to buy this incredibly expensive $120 crude oil to keep their factory running, because refineries have to run continuously. You can't just turn them on and off like a light switch without causing massive damage.
Right.
But they can't raise the price of gasoline because no one is buying it.
The cost of the cow went up, but the price of steak is crashing.
Exactly. The crack spread collapses. The refiner bleeds cash and faces bankruptcy despite sky-high oil prices.
Wow.
Conversely, look at what happens during a post-recession boom. Crude oil might be dirt cheap, say $50 a barrel, because there is a global glut of supply. But suddenly, everyone wants to drive, fly, and buy goods shipped by diesel trucks. Demand for the finished products skyrockets.
So the crack spread widens massively.
Yes, and the refineries print money buying cheap raw materials and selling expensive finished products.
Okay, and hanging over both the drillers and the refiners is the brutal physical reality of moving the liquid across the ocean. We touched on shipping earlier, but we really need to talk about the physical tax on global movement, because a barrel of oil in the Persian Gulf is not worth the same as a barrel of oil sitting in a tank in Rotterdam.
The difference is the freight.
Exactly.
To track this, the commodity markets monitor indices like the Baltic Dirty Tanker Index.
The Baltic Dirty Tanker Index.
Yeah, and dirty just refers to the fact that the ships are carrying unrefined black crude oil as opposed to clean tankers that carry refined, clear gasoline or jet fuel. This index tracks the daily cost of chartering a very large crude carrier, a VLCC, which can hold 2 million barrels of oil.
And this cost is incredibly volatile.
Immensely volatile. When the Houthi attacks began in the Red Sea, forcing global shipping companies to abandon the Suez Canal and reroute entirely around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, it completely upended the math of the oil market.
Walk through the mechanics of why a longer trip causes rates to spike so aggressively, because it's not just extra fuel.
No, it's a compounding effect. If a voyage suddenly takes an extra 15 days, that tanker is tied up for an extra month on a round trip. Because the ships are spending more time on the water, fewer ships are available at the loading ports.
Right, the supply of available vessel space shrinks dramatically.
Exactly. So oil traders who need to move their cargoes are suddenly in a bidding war for the few available ships. Charter rates skyrocket from, say, $30,000 a day to $100,000 a day. Furthermore, maritime insurance premiums spike because the risk of geopolitical conflict is higher. All of those extra costs, the time, the fuel for the ship, the insurance, the charter rate, they act as a massive, invisible physical tax on every barrel of oil moving across the water. It eats into the margins of everyone along the supply chain.
Okay, we have covered an incredible amount of ground. We've mapped the physical flow from the Middle East to Asia. We've broken down the 4 rings of getting the oil out of the dirt. We've walked through the butcher shop of the refinery, and we've paid the tanker captain to move it.
We've built the barrel.
Yes. But this leads to the most mysterious part of the entire global machine. Who actually decides the exact specific dollar amount that barrel is worth today? How does the market synthesize the geology, the refining capacity, and the tanker rates into a single number?
Which brings us to the casino and the plumbing, the commodity markets. To understand the commodity markets, the very first thing you have to realize is that, quote unquote, the price of oil, that singular number you see scrolling in green or red across the bottom of a financial news channel, is a functional illusion.
Wait, really? An illusion?
Yeah, it is a reference point. But physical oil in the real world almost never trades at exactly that number.
Because there are hundreds of different grades of oil, all in different locations.
Exactly. The actual commercial price that a refinery pays to buy a physical cargo of crude oil is determined by a baseline formula. The price equals the benchmark price, plus or minus a quality differential, plus or minus a location differential, plus or minus a time differential.
So the benchmark is just the anchor. The differentials are where the real physical market lives.
That's it, exactly.
Let's start with the anchors. The global oil market effectively relies on three major benchmark complexes. We have WTI, we have Brent, and we have the Middle East markers.
Let's start with WTI, West Texas Intermediate, because its mechanics are absolutely fascinating and explain so much of the volatility in the U.S. market. Okay, so WTI is the primary benchmark for the North American inland market. It is traded on the New York Mercantile Exchange, or NYMEX, in standardized contracts of 1,000 barrels.
Right.
When a trader buys a WTI futures contract for next month, they are technically entering into a legally binding agreement to purchase 1,000 barrels of a specific grade of light sweet crude. But the crucial defining feature of the WTI contract is that it requires physical delivery.
Okay.
And the designated delivery point is a tiny town in Oklahoma called Cushing.
I really need us to pause here and unpack this because it sounds absurd. We are talking about a global commodity worth trillions of dollars, and the price of the U.S. benchmark is legally tethered to the physical reality of a landlocked town of fewer than 10,000 people in the middle of Oklahoma. Why Cushing?
It's all about the plumbing again. Over decades, Cushing organically developed into the spaghetti junction of the North American pipeline system.
Spaghetti junction.
Yeah, a massive web of inbound pipelines bringing crude down from Canada, from the Bakken in North Dakota, and from the Rockies all intersect at Cushing. And crucially, outbound pipelines leave Cushing to carry that oil down to those massive refineries on the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast.
Right.
Because so much oil passes through this single intersection, energy companies built absolutely massive physical storage tank farms there to hold the oil while it waits for space on an outbound pipe.
So Cushing is basically a giant waiting room for oil.
Exactly.
But how does that physical waiting room dictate the paper price traded by guys in suits on Wall Street?
Because of that physical delivery requirement. Let's say you are a Wall Street hedge fund manager. Yeah. You buy a WTI futures contract, betting the price will go up.
Okay.
You don't own a refinery. You don't own a pipeline. You certainly don't own a massive steel storage tank in Oklahoma. You were just making a financial bet. As the expiration date of that contract approaches, you have to sell that contract to someone who actually wants the physical oil, like a refiner.
Because if you hold it until expiration, you are legally obligated to take physical delivery of 1,000 barrels of actual black, messy crude oil in Cushing, Oklahoma.
Exactly. And if you are a guy in a Manhattan office, having a pipeline company call you to ask where you want your 1,000 barrels of oil pumped is your absolute worst nightmare.
Yeah, where are you going to put it? In your apartment.
Right. So you must sell your paper contract before it expires.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine a scenario where there is a massive glut of oil in the U.S. The pipelines down to the Gulf Coast are full, and the massive storage tanks in Cushing are filled to the absolute brim. There is physically nowhere to put another drop of oil.
Okay, what happens to the Wall Street trader?
Panic. The trader tries to sell their contract to a commercial refiner, but the refiner says, "I don't want it. I have nowhere to store it." As the clock ticks down to expiration, the traders who cannot take physical delivery become desperate.
They start offering the contract at massive discounts.
Yeah, they will sell at any price just to avoid the catastrophic logistical nightmare of taking physical delivery. Yeah. This is the mechanism that can cause prices to crash violently. The paper market is ultimately inescapably disciplined by the physical reality of the tank space in Oklahoma.
That perfectly explains the vulnerability of WTI. It is hyperlocal. It is vulnerable to a single pipeline breaking or a tank farm filling up. Contrast that with the second major benchmark, Brent.
Brent is a fundamentally different beast. Brent is the benchmark for the seaborne market. Historically, it is based on light sweet crude extracted from offshore rigs in the North Sea between the United Kingdom and Norway.
Okay.
The critical difference is that Brent is not tethered to a landlocked tank farm. It is loaded directly onto ships.
So it can immediately access the global ocean?
Precisely.
Hmm.
Because it is immediately seaborne, it is deeply exposed to global shipping rates, international demand shifts, and maritime geopolitics. A cargo of Brent can sail to Rotterdam or it can sail to China. It is the reference price for the vast majority of crude traded around the Atlantic Basin, Europe, and Africa.
And then the third anchor is the Middle East complex, Dubai, Oman, and Murban. This is the pricing anchor for all that heavy sour and medium sour crude flowing out of the Persian Gulf and over to the massive demand centers in Asia that we mapped out earlier.
Exactly.
So those are the benchmarks. That establishes the flat price of the barrel. But earlier, you said the formula includes a time differential.
Yes.
This brings us to what feels like financial time travel. We really need to go deep into the mechanics of the futures curve, because understanding the shape of the curve is the secret to reading the psychology of the market. Let's break down the two states of the market, contango and backwardation.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to know if the global oil market is panicking or relaxing, you don't look at the flat price. You look at the time spreads.
Okay.
Let's start with contango. Contango is a state where the price of oil for delivery in the future is higher than the price of oil today.
Mm-hmm.
For example, oil delivered this month is $70, but oil delivered 6 months from now is trading at $75.
Now, to a normal person, that sounds counterintuitive. Why would a barrel in the future be more expensive than a barrel right now?
Because right now, the physical market is swimming in excess oil. Supply has massively outpaced demand. The pipelines are full, the refineries are fully stocked, and the physical storage tanks are filling up rapidly.
Like the glut we talked about in Cushing.
Exactly. If I buy a physical barrel of oil today, I have a massive liability. I have to find a storage tank, I have to pay monthly rent for that tank, I have to pay to insure the oil against fire, and I have to pay the interest on the money I borrowed to buy the oil in the first place. Storing oil is expensive.
So how does the market fix the glut?
The market fixes it through the math of contango. In a deep contango, the market is essentially paying you to act as a hoarder. It is screaming, please take this oil off the market and hide it.
Wow.
Let's walk through the physical arbitrage trade. Imagine you are a well-capitalized commodity trading house. You see that oil today is $70, and the futures contracts for 6 months from now is $75. That is a $5 premium.
Okay, I'm following.
You calculate that the cost to rent a tank, insure the oil, and finance the purchase for 6 months is only $3 per barrel.
So I have $3 in costs, but a $5 premium in the market.
Exactly. So you execute the trade, you borrow millions of dollars, you buy the physical oil today for $70, you pump it into your leased storage tank, and on the exact same day, you sell a futures contract on the NYMEX, legally locking in your right to sell that oil in 6 months for $75.
So you have just locked in a risk-free guaranteed profit of $2 per barrel minus your storage costs.
Yes, you do absolutely nothing for 6 months, and then you deliver the oil and collect your profit.
And traders will do this at massive scale, won't they? I mean, if land-based tanks are full, they will literally charter those massive VLCC tankers we talked about, fill them with 2 million barrels of oil, and just park them offshore in the ocean, using the ship as a floating storage tank, just harvesting that contango profit.
Yes, floating storage is the ultimate symptom of a massive glut. Contango incentivizes the private market to absorb the excess supply until demand can recover.
That is brilliant.
Now, the opposite state of the market is backwardation. And this is where things get violent.
Violent.
Yes. Backwardation means the price of oil today is higher than the price in the future. Today's oil is $80, but oil 6 months from now is $70.
So the market is screaming for oil right now.
Exactly. Inventories are critically low. A geopolitical event just knocked out a major pipeline, or demand is surging unexpectedly. Refineries are looking at their internal tanks and realizing they might run out of crude next week.
And if a refinery runs out of crude,
They have to shut down machines, which is incredibly dangerous and expensive. So they are willing to pay a massive premium to get physical oil today.
they don't care about the price 6 months from now. They need it to survive tomorrow.
Precisely. In a backwardated market, holding oil in a storage tank is financial suicide. Why would you pay rent to hold a barrel of oil that is worth $80 today, just to sell it for $70 in 6 months?
You wouldn't.
You wouldn't. The math of backwardation forces every trader, every storage facility to drain their tanks. They pull every available drop of oil out of storage and dump it into the spot market to capture that premium.
So the shape of the curve is the market's internal regulatory mechanism. Contango builds the safety cushion of inventory, and backwardation drains the cushion when there is an emergency.
Perfectly stated. The flat price tells you the absolute value, but the time spreads tell you the urgency.
This is a perfect point to push back on a narrative that completely dominates the political discourse.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Right. Every time the flat price of oil spikes and gasoline gets expensive, politicians and consumers instantly point the finger at quote-unquote Wall Street speculators. People driving to work feel like they are being held hostage by hedge fund managers in Manhattan who have never touched a physical pump jack or a refinery valve.
Yeah, that's a very common complaint.
The accusation is that speculators are artificially driving up the cost of living just to make a quick buck. But based on the sources, are they actually manipulating the cost of oil, or are they just placing bets on a game they don't control? We need to clear this up without taking any political sides, just looking at the mechanics.
To answer that impartially, we have to look at the data from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, which publishes weekly reports on who exactly is holding these futures contracts.
Okay.
The ecosystem requires two distinct players, hedgers and speculators, and you cannot have one without the other.
Let's define the hedger.
A hedger is a commercial entity that has physical exposure to the price of oil, and they're using the financial market to buy insurance. Take a major airline. Jet fuel is their biggest operating expense. If the price of oil doubles next year, the airline will go bankrupt because they cannot raise ticket prices fast enough to cover the cost.
Right.
So the airline goes into the futures market and buys contracts for next year at a fixed price. They are locking in their costs. They're perfectly happy to give up potential profits if oil gets cheaper because their goal is simply to survive and have predictable costs.
Or a driller in Texas who just borrowed $10 million from a bank to drill a new well. The bank demands that the driller lock in a guaranteed selling price for the oil so they know the loan will be repaid, even if the global market crashes.
Exactly. The airline and the driller are hedgers. They are trying to shed risk. But risk doesn't just disappear. If the airline wants to lock in a price, someone has to be willing to take the other side of that bet.
Someone has to absorb that risk.
Right. That is the speculator.
The hedge funds, the institutional investors, the algorithmic traders.
Yes. The speculators step in and say, we will take on the risk of price volatility in exchange for the potential of making a profit. They provide the liquidity that allows the commercial hedgers to operate.
Okay, so they provide a service. But to the question, do speculators cause high prices?
The data is very clear on this. Speculators absolutely amplify volatility because hedge funds use massive leverage and algorithmic trading. When a news headline breaks about a conflict in the Middle East, the speculators react instantly.
They buy massive amounts of paper contracts,
which drives the price up steeper and faster than it would have moved purely on physical fundamentals.
They make the roller coaster faster and the drops more violent.
Yes. However, and this is the absolute crucial point that the CFTC data reinforces, over a sustained period of time, speculators cannot permanently divorce the paper price of oil from physical reality.
Why not?
Let's say a group of rogue hedge funds decided to just buy every paper contract they could get their hands on, trying to squeeze the price of WTI up to $150 a barrel, just purely on speculation.
What stops them?
The physical delivery mechanism we talked about at Cushing. If the paper price is artificially inflated to $150, every driller in America is going to pump as fast as they can, and every refiner is going to stop buying because it's too expensive.
Oh, right.
The physical storage tanks at Cushing will fill to the brim. When those speculative futures contracts approach expiration, those hedge funds, who do not want physical oil, will be forced to liquidate their positions in a market with no buyers.
And the price crashes.
The physical reality of the full tanks will violently, forcefully pull the paper price back down to earth. Financial positioning accelerates the journey, but physical fundamental supply, demand, and inventory always dictate the final destination.
Wow. Okay. That is a brilliant deconstruction of the casino. We have covered the global map, we've broken down the cost of extracting the barrel, we've navigated the butcher shop of the refinery, and we have survived the contango time travel of the futures market.
We've been busy.
We have. Now it is time to bring this entire globe-spanning machine right to your neighborhood. We are moving from the NYMEX to the corner gas station.
The retail pump.
Yes. And this is where consumer frustration reaches its absolute peak. Because everyone has experienced this phenomenon. A war breaks out. The global crude benchmark spikes on the news, and literally that afternoon, the guy at your local station is out there with a long pole changing the plastic numbers on the sign to make gas more expensive.
Right. The price shoots up like a rocket.
But a month later, when the crisis is over and crude oil crashes back down, the price at the local pump barely budges. It floats down over weeks, agonizingly slowly.
Why does it go up like a rocket and fall like a feather?
It is the most universally hated dynamic in the energy market. The Federal Trade Commission and energy economists have studied this extensively, and they officially call it asymmetric pass-through.
Asymmetric pass-through.
Yeah. Upward cost shocks at the wholesale level are passed through to the retail consumer almost instantaneously, while downward cost shocks take weeks to fully materialize at the pump.
Well, explain the rocket first, because the immediate instinct of every driver pulling up to that pump is that the station owner is a crook.
The physical gasoline sitting in the underground tank beneath the concrete at that station is old. It was refined weeks ago. The station owner bought it days ago, presumably at the old, cheaper price. Why are they charging me today's panicked price for yesterday's cheap gas?
It feels like gouging, but it is actually a matter of sheer survival for the station owner. It comes down to a fundamental business concept called replacement cost pricing.
Okay, for replacement cost pricing.
And to understand it, you have to look at the cash flow of a typical retail gas station. Most local stations are independent franchises or small businesses. They have massive underground tanks that hold roughly 30,000 to 40,000 gallons of fuel. Depending on how busy the corner is, they might turn over that entire inventory in just a few days.
So they are constantly buying new trucks full of wholesale gasoline to refill the tanks.
Constantly. Now imagine you own a station. The wholesale gasoline market is trading relatively flat, but suddenly a massive geopolitical shock hits. A refinery goes offline, or there's an attack in the Middle East. The wholesale price of the gasoline you need to buy to refill your tanks jumps by 20 cents a gallon instantly.
Okay, I'm the owner. I see the news. But I know the 30,000 gallons currently sitting in my underground tank was purchased yesterday before the spike.
Right, so let's say you decide to be the good guy. You say, I bought this gas cheaply, so I'm going to keep my pump price low. I won't raise it until I run out of this batch. What happens?
Well, because every other station in town immediately raised their prices, my station is now the cheapest in a 5-mile radius. Everyone rushes to my pumps.
Exactly. You get swamped. You sell out of your entire 30,000-gallon inventory in a matter of hours.
Yeah.
But here is the fatal flaw in being the good guy. Because you sold all those gallons at the old, cheap price, you've only collected enough cash at the register to reflect yesterday's market. Now you have to call the distributor to order a new delivery truck to refill your empty tanks.
And the distributor says, great, the new gas costs 20 cents more per gallon.
Yes. And you look in your register, and you don't have enough cash to pay for the new delivery. You are instantly, catastrophically in a cash flow crisis. You cannot afford to restock your own store.
Oh, wow.
To survive, a retail business that turns over inventory rapidly must price its current inventory based on the estimated cost of the next delivery, the replacement cost.
Yeah.
If they don't ride the rocket up instantly, they quite literally go bankrupt the next time the delivery truck arrives.
That makes painful, logical sense. The rocket is a survival mechanism to ensure they have the working capital to buy the next load, but that immediately leads to the second half of the equation.
The feather.
Why the feather on the way down? If the wholesale market crashes today and the replacement cost plummets, why doesn't the station owner drop the price on the sign immediately? Why do they hold it high for 2 weeks?
The economists point to 3 distinct structural reasons for the feather effect. The first is margin rebuilding. Remember how we said the station owner has to hike prices instantly on the way up to survive?
Yeah.
In reality, they're often terrified of scaring away their loyal daily commuters. So when wholesale prices spike by 20 cents, they might only raise the pump price by 15 cents initially, eating a 5-cent loss on their own profit margin just to soften the blow for the customer.
So they absorb some of the shock.
Yes, but they are operating on razor-thin margins, often just pennies per gallon of net profit on the fuel itself. They make their real money selling you coffee and beef jerky inside the convenience store.
Right.
So when the wholesale crisis ends and prices finally crash, the station owner keeps the pump price artificially high for a few extra days. They are recouping the margin they sacrificed during the initial spike. They are rebuilding their balance sheet.
Okay, margin rebuilding. What is the second reason?
Inventory layering. This is the exact inverse of the rocket scenario. The wholesale market crashed today, which is great news. But the station owner unfortunately just accepted a 10,000-gallon delivery yesterday afternoon at the absolute peak of the panic pricing.
Oh, no.
They literally have highly expensive gasoline sitting in their underground tank right now.
If they drop the pump price instantly today to match the new wholesale crash, they will be selling yesterday's expensive gas at a massive loss.
Exactly. So they hold the retail price high, slowly blending in newer, cheaper wholesale deliveries over the course of several days to average down their overall cost basis before they start slashing the price on the sign.
And the third reason for the feather.
Search frictions and behavioral economics. This is purely about consumer psychology and the dynamics of a local oligopoly. Yeah, how humans behave when prices are rising is completely different from how they behave when prices are falling. When gasoline prices are skyrocketing toward $4 or $5 a gallon, consumer anxiety peaks. You become hypersensitive to price. You will actively use apps on your phone to find the absolute cheapest station, and you will aggressively drive out of your way to save 3 cents a gallon. You are punishing expensive stations.
Right, because it feels like a crisis.
But when prices finally start falling, the psychological pressure releases. Consumers relax. The station owners know human nature. They know that if the price has been dropping for a week, you are feeling relief.
Yeah.
You are not going to spend 20 minutes driving 5 miles across town, burning gas in the process, just to save 2 cents a gallon on a random Tuesday. The search friction is too high.
So the local stations effectively enter a Mexican standoff.
Exactly. The 3 stations at the intersection look at each other. None of them want to be the first to slash prices and give up profit because they know the consumer isn't hunting for pennies anymore. So they ease the prices down agonizingly slowly, a penny a day, waiting to see who blinks first.
Wow.
The rocket is driven by wholesale cash flow panic. The feather is driven by a lack of retail consumer pressure.
That perfectly bridges the gap between the economics and the psychology. And while we are at the pump, we really have to clear up the biggest misconception of all.
The crude ratio.
Yes. People look at the price of crude oil and they assume it's a 1-to-1 ratio with the price of gasoline. If a barrel of crude drops by 10%, they expect the pump to drop by 10%. But the data from the Energy Information Administration fundamentally shatters that expectation.
The EIA data is vital here. Crude oil is just the raw ingredient. Historically, the cost of the raw crude oil only makes up roughly 50% of the final price you pay at the pump. And looking forward, the projections suggest it will fall under 45% in 2026 and 2027.
Wait, more than half of the price of a gallon of gasoline has absolutely nothing to do with the global price of crude oil.
Correct. The other 50 to 55% is comprised of 3 entirely separate layers. First, you have the refining costs and profits. Remember the butcher shop and the crack spread. The refiner takes a cut for chemically transforming the sludge into usable fuel. This sets the wholesale rack price.
Okay.
Second, you have distribution and marketing, the cost of the pipeline to the terminal, the tanker truck to the station, and the marketing overhead. And finally, you have federal, state, and local taxes.
This explains why the pump price can detach completely from the global benchmark. I mean, if WTI crude oil crashes to $40 a barrel, but 2 major refineries in your region go offline simultaneously for emergency maintenance, the supply of finished wholesale gasoline plummets.
Yes.
The local station doesn't buy barrels of crude oil. They buy gallons of finished gasoline from the wholesale rack. So the pump price will stay high or even spike because the refining sector is bottlenecked regardless of how cheap the raw material is.
Exactly. You are buying a highly processed, heavily taxed, locally distributed chemical product, not a raw commodity.
Which brings us to the grand finale of our deep dive. If you want to see exactly how fragile this entire chain is, the crude sourcing, the complex refining chemistry, the taxation layers, the logistics, and the local retail competition, you just have to look at the most extreme laboratory in the country. We have to look at California.
Oh, California is the ultimate case study in compounded market fragility. It is a masterclass in how policy, geography, and chemistry can isolate a market and make it highly volatile.
Let's set the baseline reality using the numbers from the sources. As of March 14th, 2026, the U.S. national average for a gallon of regular gasoline is sitting comfortably at $3.63. But if you drive into a station in California, you are looking at an average of $5.48. That is nearly a $2 premium over the rest of the country. And the data notes this is currently being exacerbated by the maritime shipping shock in the Strait of Hormuz. We need to forensically deconstruct that $2 gap. The sources identify 5 distinct premiums stacked on top of each other. Let's walk through them layer by layer.
Let's do it. Let's start from the baseline U.S. average and build the California price. Layer 1 is the most transparent. Taxes.
Okay.
California consistently levies some of the highest fuel taxes in the nation. When you aggregate the federal excise tax, the 61-cent state excise tax, local sales taxes, and underground storage tank fees, the pure tax burden adds roughly 90 cents to every single gallon sold.
Okay, so 90 cents right off the bat goes to the government. We are at $4.53. What is layer 2?
Layer 2 is environmental compliance costs. California operates under strict, aggressive carbon reduction mandates, primarily governed by the Air Resources Board.
Right, the emissions rule.
Yeah, the two massive programs here are the Cap and Invest system, which forces refineries to buy allowances for their greenhouse gas emissions, and the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, or LCFS, which mandates a reduction in the carbon intensity of transportation fuels over time.
How do those broad regulatory programs translate to a specific cost at the pump?
Well, because the refineries incur massive costs to comply with these regulations, either by buying carbon credits or blending in expensive biofuels to meet the LCFS targets, they embed those compliance costs directly into the wholesale price of the finished gasoline. The state's Energy Commission estimates that these environmental programs add approximately 54 cents per gallon to the retail price.
So between taxes and environmental programs, we have $1.44 in pure policy premiums. What is layer 3?
Layer 3 is the chemistry, the special blend. To combat the severe smog problems that historically plague basins like Los Angeles, California mandates a unique, incredibly strict, cleaner-burning formulation of gasoline known as CARB gas.
Right.
Furthermore, the chemical recipe changes depending on whether it's summer or winter.
And refining this boutique fuel requires highly specialized, expensive hardware.
It does. It requires removing specific compounds and adding others to ensure the fuel burns cleanly at specific temperatures. The pure production cost of manufacturing this specialized CARB blend adds roughly 10 to 15 cents a gallon compared to conventional gasoline.
Which, frankly, doesn't sound like a massive premium on its own. 15 cents for cleaner air seems like a reasonable trade-off. But the sources point out that this specific chemical requirement sets a structural trap, which leads directly into layer 4.
Exactly. Layer 4 is isolation and logistics. Because California legally requires this unique, bespoke chemical blend, they cannot integrate with the rest of the U.S. pipeline system. If there's a gasoline shortage in Los Angeles, they cannot simply open a valve and pipe in excess conventional gasoline from the massive refining complexes in Texas or Louisiana. It would be illegal to burn it. In fact, there are literally 0 finished gasoline pipelines crossing the Rocky Mountains into California.
They have completely severed themselves from the national grid. They are a fuel island.
A total island. So if a California refinery goes offline for maintenance, where do they get their backup supply of CARB-compliant gasoline? It has to be manufactured by a small handful of highly specialized refineries overseas, often located in places like South Korea, Singapore, or India, that have the technical capability to brew the California recipe.
And then that backup fuel has to be loaded onto a tanker and slowly shipped across the Pacific Ocean.
Yes.
Which completely explains why California prices are specifically spiking right now during the March 2026 Hormuz shipping shock. Their emergency backup supply chain is entirely reliant on international maritime logistics. If global shipping rates spike or routes are disrupted, California feels it acutely because they have 0 domestic pipeline safety net.
Precisely. Their isolation makes them incredibly vulnerable to global maritime volatility, and that leads to the final structural layer, layer 5, tight capacity. California's in-state refining capacity is actively shrinking. As the state pushes aggressively toward electric vehicles and decarbonization, energy companies are not investing billions of dollars to build new refineries or maintain old ones. Many are converting existing facilities to produce renewable diesel or shutting them down entirely. The EIA issued a stark warning that California would see a 17% drop in pure refining capacity by mid-2026.
So you have a highly specialized boutique fuel legally trapped in a geographic island being produced by a shrinking pool of aging, functional refineries. It is a recipe for extreme volatility.
It is a market operating with 0 margin for error.
Okay, but I want to push back here because I am doing the math on the premiums we just discussed. We have 90 cents for taxes. We have 54 cents for environmental programs. Let's add 15 cents for the special blend. That adds up to $1.59 in structural costs. But the gap between the national average and the California average right now is $1.85. There is a missing chunk of change there. We have a gap of almost 30 cents, and historically, the sources say it has been much wider. Is someone just pocketing the rest of that money? Is this corporate price gouging? We need to look at what the research actually says.
You have just walked into one of the most hotly contested debates in energy economics. You are referring to a phenomenon that UC Berkeley energy economist Severin Borenstein famously dubbed the mystery gasoline surcharge.
The mystery surge.
Yeah, and the data backs up your math. The California Energy Commission's own Division of Petroleum Market Oversight released a report in 2024 confirming this unexplained gap.
What did the report find?
They found that prior to 2015, the price difference between California and the rest of the U.S. was almost entirely explained by the taxes and the environmental fees. The math lined up perfectly. But in February 2015, a massive explosion tore through the ExxonMobil refinery in Torrance, California. That single refinery produced roughly 10% of the state's specialized CARB gasoline. It was knocked offline for over a year.
A massive chunk of the island's supply vanished overnight.
Instantly. Prices obviously skyrocketed. But the mystery is what happened after the refinery was eventually repaired and brought back online. The premium never fully went away.
Really?
The state report showed that post-2015, the unexplained gap, the premium that absolutely cannot be accounted for by taxes, fees, and blend costs, jumped from a historical average of 0 up to an average of $1.23 per gallon during certain peak periods.
It just materialized out of thin air after the fire, so where exactly is that massive chunk of money going?
The state oversight reports point squarely to higher gross refining and distribution margins. The profit margins expanded. But we have to be incredibly precise here about the mechanics of how that happens. It is not necessarily the local mom-and-pop gas station owner gouging you at the corner. Industry data routinely shows their net retail profit remains stubbornly low, maybe 15 cents a gallon. The margin expansion is happening upstream, in the wholesale and refining sector.
Explain the mechanics of that. I mean, if it's not illegal price fixing, how do they suddenly command a massive premium just because a refinery blew up a decade ago?
Because the Torrance fire exposed the fundamental reality of a low slack market. In a normal, healthy market, you have excess capacity slack. If one factory goes down, another factory spins up to take its market share. But California's market is highly concentrated, with only a few major players producing the specialized fuel, and capacity is shrinking.
So there is absolutely zero slack in the system.
Zero. They operate every day, right on the razor's edge of supply and demand.
So the system is stretched tight as a drum.
Exactly. When you have a low slack market trapped on a geographic island, the suppliers realize something profound. Whenever a refinery goes offline, whether it's a catastrophic explosion or just planned routine maintenance, the entire wholesale supply chain suddenly gains massive asymmetric pricing power.
Because the buyers have nowhere else to go.
Precisely. The distributors and the unbranded retail stations need gasoline to survive. They can't pipe it in from Texas. They know that emergency replacement barrels are sitting on a slow boat from South Korea, 3 weeks away. So scarcity pricing kicks in immediately.
Wow.
The refineries and distributors that are still operating can charge a massive premium, widening their margins simply because the alternative for the buyer is to run completely out of fuel. The mystery surcharge is essentially the brutal economic math of operating a hyper-fragile, isolated market where the suppliers hold immense leverage the second anything disrupts the delicate balance.
That is a staggering masterclass in unintended consequences. I mean, the state mandates a boutique fuel formulation to clean the air, which achieves its environmental goal, but structurally isolates the market. The isolation removes the geographic safety net of pipelines. The push for decarbonization halts investment in new facilities, shrinking the capacity. And the combination of all these well-intentioned policies transfers immense structural pricing power to the remaining refiners whenever the wind blows the wrong way.
It perfectly illustrates our initial thesis. Oil is not just oil. The price you pay is the result of chemistry, geography, and local policy layered violently on top of a global financial benchmark.
Let's take a breath and zoom all the way out. We have gone on an incredible, complex journey today. We started with the physical dirt, mapping the heavy sludge of the Venezuelan pantry against the massive, light sweet production kitchens of the U.S. shale patch. We stripped down the 4 economic rings of the barrel, contrasting the cheap lifting costs of a Saudi well against the relentless capital treadmill of a Texas shale rig.
We walked into the butcher shop of the refinery to understand the crack spread, learning how a refiner can go bankrupt even when crude oil is cheap if the consumer demand for the finished steak evaporates.
We stepped onto the trading floor of the futures casino, watching hedgers and speculators use the mechanisms of contango and backwardation to balance the world's physical storage tanks in Oklahoma. We stood at the local gas pump and decoded the infuriating rockets and feathers math, driven by the brutal cash flow realities of replacement cost pricing. And finally, we unpacked the five policy layers and the mystery surcharge of California's hyperfragile market island.
My genuine hope is that the next time you, the listener, pull up to a pump or see a station owner out there with a long pole changing the plastic numbers on the sign, you don't just see a random annoyance or a greedy business owner. You realize you're actually witnessing the real-time, highly localized collision of global shipping constraints in the Red Sea. Wall Street algorithms balancing risk, complex hydrocracking chemistry, and incredibly tight retail margins. It is a globe-spanning machine of staggering complexity, operating right on the razor's edge every single day.
It is a miraculous, terrifying machine. But here's the provocative thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over as you go about your week. We have spent an entire century building this hyper-optimized, incredibly delicate global infrastructure entirely around the premise of safely moving, refining, and pricing liquid fossil fuel. But as the world slowly, unevenly attempts to transition toward electric vehicles and alternate energy sources, what actually happens to the plumbing of this machine? We assume it will just smoothly and quietly wind down. But as capital investment dries up, as pipelines are decommissioned, and as aging refineries close down for good, just like we are seeing right now in California, does the loss of slack in the system mean the end will be smooth? Or does the rapid dismantling of the infrastructure guarantee that the very last drops of oil we burn will actually be the most volatile, the most expensive, and the most chaotic barrels in human history?
It is a profound structural question. If the refining and distribution capacity disappears faster than the internal combustion engines actually come off the road, the extreme volatility we see isolated in California today might just be a preview of the broader global market tomorrow.
The diagnostic X-ray of this market is only going to get murkier. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will be back next time with another stack of material to unpack. Until then, keep asking questions.